Good morning, everyone. My name is Maki Park. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. And I'm so very sorry not to be able to be with you all in person today. But I'm also so grateful to my colleagues on this panel, and especially to Marcia for organizing this group and being willing to include me remotely in this discussion. This is an issue that's so personal to me, and I'm also so thankful for all of you for choosing to be part of this conversation. We at MPI have been working on issues pertaining to young children of immigrants and dual language learners for quite a while now. And it didn't take me long in this work to recognize that in spite of the fact that this was an arena focused on the experiences of immigrant families, I didn't really see my own family's experiences reflected in most of the research and the literature that exists on this topic. I also recognized that it was hard to really find a place to insert my own experience and perspective in this world, which, as with all issues, comes with its own set of politics and established players in history to navigate. So I'm hoping that today's session will be an opportunity to really delve into questions of how to not only make a place and a home for AAPI issues in the early childhood research and advocacy field, but also how to effectively ally with and build coalitions with other groups, especially minority groups, who share many of the same concerns and desired outcomes as we do in trying to move forward key issues of racial equity and social justice. By way of overview, what I wanted to cover in this brief presentation today is a bit of a demographic portrait that provides a very broad overview of the AAPI young child population, both in terms of showing the rapid growth of this population, as well as the growing diversity of cultures and experiences within this population, to make the case for why we should care about AAPIs in early childhood, as well as discussing quickly what some of the implications of this information might be. I'll also talk quickly about one particular initiative happening in Minnesota in an attempt to advance these issues, and what some of the potential lessons learned might be from that experience. And I'll close with some broad reflections and with some pointed questions that I hope might lead to discussion among those of you in the room today. And all of the demographic information that I'll be presenting today comes from this report on superdiversity within the DLL population that came out a little while ago now and which you can find on our website. This report focuses on the AAPI as well as the Black DLL population, which are both relatively understudied populations within the DLL subgroup. So beginning with a quick look at dual language learners overall at the national level, just to situate us in a larger context. For those of you who may be new to the topic, we define dual language learners as any young child who has at least one parent who speaks a language other than English in their home. This means that they're exposed to at least two languages as they develop their own language skills and identity in their formative years, and therefore have the potential to emerge as bilingual individuals. And DLLs are a fast-growing and a large group in the US. They now make up over 1 in 4 and nearly 1 in 3 of all young children ages 0 to 8 in the United States. Not only that, but they're increasingly dispersed across different states. So DLLs make up a significant proportion of young children across almost all states at this point, as you can see in this graphic. Not a niche or boutique issue, but one that is affecting early childhood systems across the country. And DLLs are a diverse group, especially compared to non-DLL children. 62% of DLLs are Hispanic, as you can see in this graphic. 16% are white, 15% are Asian, 6% are Black, and 1% identify as American Indian. The composition of DLLs is also changing rapidly due to changing immigration patterns. This chart isn't the most intuitive to read, but what it's showing is the changing language composition of languages spoken among DLL parents in the US. The left side column shows all DLL parents currently in the US, whereas the right side column shows only recently arrived immigrant DLL parents within the last 10 years. So on the right-hand side, you can see the falling percentage of Spanish-speaking DLL parents and the rising share of other languages such as Arabic, Hindi, Tagalog, and Telugu. And this next chart shows similar patterns, but with countries of origin rather than languages spoken. So again, on the right-hand side, among more recently arrived DLL families, you see the changing profile of DLL parents who are increasingly coming from a more diverse range of countries, whereas Mexico predominates on the left-hand side. Shares of arrivals you can see from India and China are rising, as well as other smaller countries like Burma. So with all that as a backdrop, we can turn to AAPI DLLs within the overall DLL population to see what this group specifically looks like. And coming off of seeing these two charts, you may have already guessed that AAPIs are a fast-growing population. AAPIs, in fact, are the fastest growing group in the United States and have been since 2000. If these trends continue, Asians are actually projected to become the largest immigrant group in the United States by the year 2055. As of 2011 to 2015, in the census data, there were 1.8 million young AAPI DLLs in the United States. And these AAPI DLLs make up 18% of the overall DLL population, though this percentage is likely to grow significantly in the coming years. This next graphic shows us how AAPI DLLs compare with DLLs overall in the US. In general, as you might expect, AAPI DLLs as a whole tend to fare better than DLLs overall on many measures of typical child well-being. On aggregate, they're less likely to live in poverty, they're less likely to have parents who are low educated, and they're less likely to live in linguistically isolated households where no member of the family speaks English well. They're also more likely to live in two-parent households, which is often cited as an important protective factor. However, these aggregate data, of course, have the effect of masking the experiences of subgroups within this population whose experiences are marked by several risk factors and inequities. The fact that smaller diverse groups of refugees from Southeast Asia, for example, who are highly likely to live in low-income households, are grouped together in this data with relatively well-off immigrants who've arrived from India and China has the ultimate outcome of making their experiences less visible. So thinking about some of the unrecognized elements of diversity within the AAPI experience, we can look to this next slide. As I was just saying, several recently arrived Asian groups face significant barriers to economic advancement. For example, more than 1/3 of Bhutanese American and Burmese Americans living in the United States live in poverty, and 82% of Bhutanese and 65% of Burmese adults in the US have less than a high school education. Similarly, for many groups such as the Hmong and the Karen, educational outcomes tend to be some of the lowest in terms of both achievement and high school completion due to systemic barriers to their academic success. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about steps that are being taken in Minnesota in an effort to bring awareness and accountability around these issues, but this is a challenge that is a relative blind spot for many policymakers and advocates across the country. As a result, AAPI DLLs are often underserved as a whole by public ECEC programs. They're under-enrolled in preschool, sometimes at lower levels even than their DLL peers in several states, and they underparticipate significantly in programs like the Child Care Development Block Grant. The model minority myth, in addition to being harmful on a societal level as we think about how to build unity among communities of color, is also harmful on a policy level when a lack of equitable access to services goes unnoticed because of a misconception that Asians as a whole are a successful group who have no need for public support. Lastly, this is a somewhat separate issue, but I think also speaks to the misconceptions about Asian immigrants in the US in terms of their visibility. But many people don't think of Asian immigrants when they think about mixed status families or unauthorized individuals who may be negatively impacted by immigration policy changes that are being instituted at a federal level by the current administration. In fact, 15% of the unauthorized immigrant population in the US hails from Asia. This means that 1 in 7 Asian immigrants in the US are unauthorized and are therefore a highly vulnerable group facing high degrees of uncertainty and low access to critical benefits. This, of course, has particularly important ramifications for young children who are significantly impacted by family economic stability in their early development. Asian DLLs are also a highly diverse group in terms of languages spoken, even more so than DLLs overall. A very high proportion of Asian DLLs speak low-incidence minority languages, often those who also face the highest risk factors, as I was just discussing. And this linguistic diversity within the Asian population is also growing rapidly. This graph here shows the share of DLL families who spoke a top 5 or a top 10 language among Asian languages over the last 10 years. And you can see that over time, the share of families who speak these relatively more common languages is shrinking, which means that a larger share of families are speaking languages that are relatively unknown, especially at local levels. And likely, they have close to zero support in terms of translated materials, interpretation, language access provisions, or ECEC staff who reflect the cultures and languages of the families they serve. This presents a really important and critical challenge in thinking about access and quality in early childhood services for these families. And here you can get a quick look at the language profile and parental countries of origin for the AAPI DLL population and the long list of low incidence minority languages spoken by this group. And this is only the top of the list, so you can imagine how long this goes on. Chinese is unsurprisingly the most commonly spoken language among AAPI DLLs, but this language only captures 17% of the population overall, with another 10% each speaking either Vietnamese or Tagalog, and the percentages quickly drop to 7% and then to lower than even 3% in the top 10. I'm going to just mention some of these other policy implications quickly, since they're not necessarily specific to AAPI DLLs, but really touch more on this issue of growing diversity overall. But really, all of these implications stem from this issue of how to address the needs created by growing linguistic and cultural diversity among the DLL population. The first issue, of course, is improved and disaggregated data collection that makes subgroups more visible and allows policymakers to see in real time these demographic changes that are occurring in their states and communities, as often these changes happen quite rapidly. You can't serve your young child population well if you don't know who they are and what their characteristics, their strengths, and their needs might be. And this is a big gap in early childhood systems overall, as we know that many ECEC systems cannot even identify yet who DLLs are in their system until they reach kindergarten, if that. As I was just saying, instructional approaches and teacher preparation also need to reflect the needs of multilingual and multicultural classrooms, where not only practice but research also remains very thin. Similarly, assessment instruments and guidance for assessments also need to take into account this multilingual and super diverse reality. At best, assessments are translated maybe into Spanish and maybe into Chinese, but this leaves out a huge swath of the population. Many assessments also lack guidance for how to administer tools effectively in the case where English is not the home language of a young child. As you all know, this can lead to both under and over referrals to special education services for many DLLs with dire consequences. Family engagement strategies for families who speak low-incidence minority languages is also a critical challenge. How do you reach families and create partnerships and relationships with them in the absence of a shared language? What kinds of provisions need to be in place to make sure that programs are providing a bare minimum of access to information and support for families in these cases? And all of this, of course, ties to language access provisions, which, even when they are written into law, are often lacking in actual implementation. I wanted to close here by pointing out a bright spot in the field relating to the issue of data collection and data disaggregation. In the past few years, we have been partnering with the Coalition of Asian American Leaders in Minnesota, and they played an integral role in Minnesota to pass the All Kids Count Act in 2016. This legislation was introduced specifically due to the lack of awareness and resources devoted to several high-need AAPI communities in Minnesota that the coalition represents. This is a data disaggregation act that requires the Minnesota Department of Education at a state level to disaggregate student data to reveal disparities along lines of race and ethnicity, English language ability, and other factors to ensure that all groups are visible and that the department is held accountable for the outcomes of all groups. What's notable about this legislation is that not only does it disaggregate the most populous groups within each larger racial and ethnic grouping, but it also specifically calls out the Karen group, which is relatively small, but is known to have some of the biggest achievement gaps in Minnesota. The other notable thing I wanted to mention about this legislation is how it came to pass. And this was a major coalition building effort on the part of the Coalition of Asian American Leadership, as well as several other organizations that represent other minority groups. They were really able to mobilize and rally around this legislation across the spectrum of DLL and other racial advocacy groups, which is the only way that this effort could have succeeded. And I think that this is something that we do not see often enough in the field. And of course, while this legislation has now passed and is being put into place, the advocacy does not stop there. This is a huge undertaking for the department. It's not a funded mandate, and the coalition is continuing to push on implementation to make sure the letter and the intent of the law is being carried out, which has continued to be a challenge. And as I was saying about language access as well, it's really in implementation often that we see things fall through the cracks. So continued advocacy in the field, understanding what's really happening and how people's lives are being affected and improved by these policies is just a really important thing to keep an eye on. So I'm going to stop here. I've put some questions for reflection in a final slide that my colleagues will use to facilitate a continued discussion. Again, I so regret not being able to be in the room in person with all of you, and I wanted to once again express my gratitude for your presence and your engagement in this conversation. Please be in touch, and I look forward to continuing to communicate to lift these issues up and learn from one another. Thank you.